I have Sue Leonard here and her gaited Appaloosa saddle horse, Hallie. Sue's here to help me today to demonstrate how a horse's conformation is what determines its best, most natural gait under saddle. A lot of people buy a horse based on registration and thinking that the registration will determine the horse's gait. For example, if they buy a Missouri Foxtrotter, they assume that since it's a registered Missouri Foxtrotter, it will do a natural foxtrot. Well, you know, much of the time that's true, but much of the time that's not true. There's a lot of cross blood between many of the gaited breeds, and you may very well have a blue papered foxtrotter, and that's a foxtrotter that has 4 registered sets of parents behind it, who actually does a much better run walk or rack than a foxtrot. And that gait is determined by the way the horse is built or conformed as opposed to the way that it's registered. The same thing is true of Tennessee walking horses, Icelandics, any kind of gaited horse that you can name. I'm not trying to pick just on foxtrotters. So today we're going to show a number of different horses. We're going to point out some important angles and help to demonstrate how those angles are going to determine the way the horse is going to move under saddle. Now Hallie is just a 4-year-old. Is she just 4? And we've painted up her shoulder angle for you and her arm angle so that you can clearly see what I can see looking at the horse's bone structure. Now the shoulder runs from the front edge of the wither down the scapula to the point of shoulder. Now that angle very much determines how long your horse's stride is going to be in front. If you continue that line all the way down to the ground, that will show you very clearly how long the horse's front stride is likely to be. That's an important consideration. Now Hallie actually has a pretty nice reach in front, a moderate reach. It's not real long, but it's really a nice, moderately long reach. Now Hallie also has an arm here that's nice and long. The length of the arm helps determine how much scope or roll the horse is going to have in the shoulder. If you have a very short arm, the horse is going to have very little scope or roll. It's going to be a little bit more of a jarring gait than if it has a nice long arm like we see here. How the arm is angled determines often how much lift there is. Remember, the shoulder determines length of stride, the arm determines how much lift. Hallie has a very nice lift because it's a fairly vertical angle. Now if this angle were quite horizontal like this, there would be very little room for lift between the shoulder and the arm. And I'm going to illustrate that here with my little ruler. Because she has angles like this, there's room for plenty of lift. Not a lot, but plenty of lift. She's going to be able to roll and lift nicely from the front. Now, if her arm were like this, she would have very, very little lift. Now, if you were to think of the Paso Fino gait, those horses are built, they're bred, the Fino horses are bred to have very straight shoulders and horizontal arms because they have very little lift and very little reach. They just sort of pitter-patter along in front. On the other hand, if you have a fox trotting horse, they have a nice laid-back shoulder. The shoulder's laid back more like this so that the horse has a lot of reach. But then they have a very horizontal arm, so there's not very much lift. So they reach long in front and have very little lift. Okay. Now Hallie is going to have a moderately long reach, a moderately high lift, and lots of roll in front because she's got the length of arm here. So you can look at her and know how this horse, when she's fully developed, she's still very young, when she's fully developed and moving the way she should, how she's most likely to move in front. The next angle that we want to look at is the angle and length of the hip. Hallie here has a really decent length hip, and that comes from the point of hip to the point of buttock. And you feel down here, she's in such good flesh that's sort of hard to feel the point of buttock, but you can feel here where a ledge comes in, and that's where the hip joint is, and that's the point of buttock. And this is the angle of that bone, right through here. Now, the angle of the bone helps to determine how much that horse is able to drop down, to drop its croup down for collection under saddle. This mirror doesn't have yet as much drop down as you would expect. But if you stand back and look at her, you can see that she's still a little rump high. And that's because she's 4 years old and she's still growing. When she grows, her next growth spurt is likely to be in her front end. That'll raise up, and as her front end raises up, as the front end raises up, this will naturally begin to tilt down a little more. So when I look at her, I look at a horse that's probably going to have more ability to drop under herself than what is apparent right here, right now. This line, from the point of buttock to the stifle, and the stifle is a joint at the top of the horse's leg, determines how much swing the horse has underneath its body. If you were to liken this joint to a human's shoulder, you would be able to tell that because my shoulder joint is located at the very top of the limb, just as the stifle joint is at the top of the horse's limb, I'm able to take my arm and swing it the full length of my limb. I have a lot of swing. Now, if my shoulder were to be positioned down 4 or 5 inches, that would really shorten my amount of swing or length of stride underneath. If my elbow were actually my last joint, equivalent to my shoulder, I would have extremely short swing, extremely short reach. That's what we have coming here. Is this stifle determines how high or low it is on the horse's leg, determines how much swing or reach the horse has behind. And this horse has, at this point, a relatively limited ability to drop herself underneath herself. The stifle is just moderate. It's not excessively high. Some horses have a stifle situated way up at the top, and that means that they can just really reach and swing underneath themselves. Other horses have a stifle set quite a bit lower than this. That means they have a short swing. She has moderate, but she's young and she's still changing. And she is sort of geared to have a lot of roll when she moves, and so that she actually pushes that leg really nicely under herself, but she's never going to have, for example, a 10 or 12 inch overstride because she just doesn't have a high enough stifle to be able to do that. She does, though, have good length of leg. You'll see that there's plenty of curve here and that she stands somewhat camped under herself, but not extraordinarily so. If she stands way under herself so that she's sickle-hocked, you would consider that a fault. This horse is certainly not sickle-hocked, and she has good length of leg, so that means that when she does swing, the leg's going to come far under her because there's a lot of it. If I were to, at this point, point out one thing, I would like to see a little more muscle here in the gaskin on this horse, but she's been ridden only lightly at this point, and that's going to develop up. Now, just as in the front, the shoulder and arm determine how much lift, reach that you have, we have the same thing going here. The relationship of these two angles help to determine how much lift the horse is going to have. This horse's angles are quite close together. In other words, they're not open. If you have angles that are set close together, that means you don't have a lot of lift. You're likely to have more reach, which this horse has more reach than she has lift. And that's not likely to change a lot. The ratio between this and this is not likely to change a lot. Now, if you were to change this up so that this was really open, this horse would have much more lift. Another important thing that we want to look at, but I want to caution people about this because when I show people how this works, they tend to want to focus just on this particular aspect of conformation, excluding all others. And this is just just one thing that we look at when we look at horses. We come down to the end of the spine, that we're looking at the sacroiliac area of the horse, because how wide this area is largely determines whether the horse is likely to be diagonally oriented or laterally oriented, whether the horse is likely to do something more akin to a trot or fox trot, or likely to do something more akin to a pace or stepping pace, or perhaps a running walk, though running walk horse can be somewhat diagonal or lateral. But what we have here is the very end of the spine. You come down and you feel to where you don't feel the spine anymore. You can mark that spot if you like. And then you go from there and push in hard until you feel a shelf. And that's where the loin is actually joined into the horse's back. The space between that area in relation, in proportion to all the rest of the horse's body. I mean, if you have a very large horse, you expect to have more space there. If you have a very small horse, you're going to expect to have less space there proportionally. But with this horse, what you do is you see that amount of space, and if it's extremely wide, there's an extremely long distance between those two spots, you're almost surely going to have a horse that tends to be lateral or tends to be somewhat pacey. If these two spots are quite close together, like this, you're probably going to have a horse that tends to be diagonal or tends to be on the trotty side of things. If you have a horse where it's just a moderate degree, and when I think of moderate, on average, I think about 3 inches, then chances are you have a horse that can swing anywhere from trot to pace. If you have a horse that can swing anywhere from trot to pace, you have a nice loose moving horse, almost surely, and you have a horse that can do any number of gaits in the gait spectrum, everything from pace to step pace to rack to run walk to foxtrot to trot.